Welcome, Jayme. We're so excited.
Hi, it's nice to be here as well. I always enjoy a good recording because I feel like I always watch it back and I'm like, oh, I tell much worse jokes than I think I do when I'm coming up with them in my head. So I'm super excited to be here tonight. My name is Jayme. I'm the director of URJ 6 Point Sci-Tech Academy East, which is a science and technology overnight camp over in Byfield, Massachusetts, which is right outside of Boston. So we are specialty camps, which mean that all of our kids come from all over the country to specialize in a specific area. And one of the areas that we have at camp, one of our workshops, our specialty areas, is video game design. And so every year, without fail, on opening day, I have parents come up, or parents, families, adult family members come up and ask me about what video games I would suggest for their kid, because all their kid wants to play is ones that involve violence in a way that makes them uncomfortable. And so from that, I've been thinking over the last couple of years about two things. One is to just give some concrete research and information on like what scientists have found about the impact of violence in video games. The answers might surprise you based on kind of how often it's in the news. There's the sneak peek is that there's not too much evidence that there's a direct correlation, which is great. But then the second part of the question is like, how do I give parents a few more tools or a few more questions to really have values-based conversations with their kids about the content in video games? Because even if there's no empirical evidence that a video game may make you violent, there are plenty of other reasons to play or not play a certain video game based on the kind of values and conversations that you're having at home, or even just how a video game makes you feel, regardless of the content on the screen. So speaking of screen, I'm going to share my screen. So this really is Sci-Tech's guide to talking with kids about violence in video games. So our quests for today, our agenda items are, we're going to talk about what we mean when we say a video game is violent. I'm going to throw up some clips of some video games and talk about some of the ways that I have heard parents talk about how and why a video game seems more violent than others. We're going to dive a little bit for a few slides into what Jewish text and Jewish tradition has to say about violence. It pops up a lot in Jewish tradition and in Jewish texts. Some of the psychological and behavioral effects of video games, both ones that people would consider positive and ones that maybe make you a little more anxious. And then some suggestions and questions about how you can have conversations with your kids about some of the moral and symbolic messages of violence in video games. And then also just thinking about how we can prepare kids for the social forms of emotional violence they're going to encounter. Video game communities are just microcosms of a larger human community. And so if you can imagine that any of the social problems that we experience out in the real world, IRL, we're also going to wind up experiencing online and with each other. So how can you help them navigate those as they navigate through the video game world? Awesome. Some things I won't do today is I'm not going to tell you what games are okay or not okay. I totally trust that you are making really wonderful decisions about what games are appropriate for your family. And I'm not going to try to convince you that playing video games is appropriate or inappropriate. Every family is different and every child reacts differently to different kinds of content. And we're also going to not tell you the right way to respond to your kids' interests or media choices or what's best for your family. Every family is different. Every child is different. And you all are the experts of your own homes. So instead, what we are going to tell you is, all I said, just some of the data and statistics about some of the behavioral and psychological effects, but also just some suggestive questions for ways you can think about how to talk with your child about the content. So I want to start with thinking about what is violence. This word means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. There are some things in video games that bother people more than others. Over the course of doing a few of these meetings, I've come to some consistencies about what makes people a little uncomfortable here in the United States primarily. So I'm going to show a few clips and talk about what I've seen and heard from other parents. And of course, in the chat, feel free to throw any comments or thoughts here. So this is a clip from Minecraft. So I'm going to play them semi-quietly. Oops, sorry, should make sure that the sound is shared. Mostly because I want to make sure that oh no, everything went away. No, come back. Oh, of course it exited out. No. See, this is why I love recordings, is I can watch how awkwardly I make sounds when something disappears without my permission. Awesome, I pulled it back up. So I'm going to show it without much commentary. Just at first, I'll just say this is a clip of Minecraft, because oftentimes we're making snap decisions about whether or not something feels violent or not violent to us. There's usually a lot going on in the home, especially now that we're all in the home much more often than maybe we used to. So first I'll just show the clip and then talk about things I've heard about how other people have felt. All right, let's try this again. Second time's the charm. Yay! I believe, does everyone see this nice wooden slat? Beautiful. Now it's time for a commercial, because the thing I had pulled up, hydrating face cream is above board, not usually considered violent. We will let it play through. Oh no. There we go. Awesome. So that was about 15 seconds of a video game called Minecraft, probably one of the most popular well-known video games, I would say, in the world, not just in the United States, very common, especially with teens. That clip was very specific. I chose a clip of the very rare amounts of conflict that happen in Minecraft. There's actually a totally different mode in Minecraft where folks are just building and creating things. So typically when I show this clip and I ask, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how violent would you consider this? Usually I get somewhere between like a 4 and a 7, with 4, like 1 being less violent and 10 being the most violent. And usually when people say the reason it doesn't bother me so much is it's very cartoonish looking, right? It's very pixelated. It has no real, it doesn't feel like it's trying to imitate real life. The things that you're hurting don't look like people, right? They just look like scary monsters like spiders, or the thing you saw was the Enderman. But also because a lot of them have some familiarity with Minecraft and know that a lot of the game is actually building things and creating things like your own home within the game. Versus, no, I have to pull up this other one, versus another popular game, another type of game that people often reference when they're talking about violence in video games are things called first-person shooters. So first-person shooters are games that are from the perspective of someone who is holding a toy gun. So I will show a quick clip from a game called Call of Duty. And I'm sure we'll get an ad because I haven't paid yet for YouTube Prime one of these days. And just as a heads up, there are gunshot noises. So if that's something that bothers you, please feel free to turn the volume down.
HVA, you have your orders. They're pulling ahead.
Threat neutralized.
So typically I get a much different response when I show a clip of Call of Duty. It's much more realistic. There's much more, there's an attempt by the game developers to make it feel more realistic, to make it feel more like real life. It's modeled off of like military gameplay. I know many people who are in the military who of course say it's nothing at all like what the military is actually like, but the intent is there to kind of feel more real life and militaristic. Some feel different than others. There's another game called Fortnite that also similarly involves guns and shooting, but a lot of times people don't think of that one as quite as violent, and I'll show a quick kind of picture for folks. Mostly because even though it still involves guns, there's also silly costumes involved, there's silly dances, like it's very removed from kind of that real life situation. Here we go. It's also not from a first person perspective, and I'll show a clip once this ad is done, how that I'm done. But really that emphasis on like guns, I think guns in America are very quickly a sign of violence. It's a hot button issue for some very good reasons here in the United States, and also the tendency towards real life looking graphics and things like that. versus, and I'll show you a quick clip from Fortnite. This one still gets rated as violent, but slightly less so. And I think it's because the primary colors in Fortnite are things like purple and pink. You can see also with guns, they're trying, there's some building involved. They're building a shelter right now. And trying not to get shot. And it's a lot of that for a very long period of time. So still with the guns, but slightly less so, mostly because it's a little bit more cartoonish. So usually what Call of Duty gets like a 9 or 10 in terms of violence, Fortnite will get something like a 7 or an 8. So a lot of it falls down to what the graphics look like and not necessarily the actions that are being taken in the game. And this is pretty common. I think as technology gets more and more impressive, it's very easy to make things that look and resemble like a real life movie. So that's been a cause of concern over the years. But often at the end of the day, you get very different answers depending on who you're talking to, which conveniently is also when we're thinking about what the Jewish perspective on violence is. The answer typically is like, it really depends on whether or not like you consider violence a good thing or a bad thing. There's lots of differing perspectives on when and how violence is appropriate. So I chose some sections with the help of my good friend, Rabbi Dan Medwin, who is in charge of digital media over at the CCAR. So we put together some examples in thinking about where violence shows up in Jewish tradition. And we'll start with our favorite, of course, which is the Torah. So there's tons of violence in the Torah, right? Like if you actually read through all of the stories, there's an incredible amount of violence, both interpersonal, both in terms of God committing acts of violence. There's violence between people, ones that are both celebrated and condemned, right? So we have God committing acts of violence. We actually just got through a holiday where there was tons of violence. Passover is just one long celebration of freeing ourselves from Egypt, but also celebrating and mourning the loss of life during the plagues. So there's floods, there's destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. There's also, of course, examples of God calling for violence against others. There's lots of military warfare in the Torah. And of course, there's countless examples of violence between people. Even our lovely Rosh Hashanah story, while the violence was not committed, there was the intent of violence in terms of the sacrifice of Abraham and Isaac. So there's lots of examples of violence indicated between people. And yet, even though there's tons of violence throughout the entire Torah, the central and most repeated commandment in the Torah is love your neighbor as yourself. So there's a little bit of a dichotomy there between what is being presented, and also what the highest commandment is. Of course, we don't just have Torah in Jewish tradition, we also have rabbinic commentary on that Torah. So throughout history, we've seen that rabbis will downplay, dismiss, or de-emphasize different aspects of violence. So we can use the Hanukkah story as a great example. Originally, the story very much so about a military victory. But over time, in order to kind of de-emphasize that military victory, rabbis started making more and more of the celebration about the miracle of the oil and making it more of a celebration of light and also of life. Additionally, there are some commandments in there. I believe it is actually appropriate to like stone your rebellious child. Of course, that is not appropriate and incredibly violent. And through the series of, much rabbinic commentary, they actually made the requirements of what counted as a rebellious child so impossible that it was going to be impossible to actually ever commit that sort of violence on a child that you considered rebellious. And then, of course, one of the most famous phrases, like an eye for an eye, eventually over time, rather than being interpreted as like a physical eye for an eye in the case of a violent repercussion, it got interpreted to mean a financial equivalent. So it took away the physical harm aspect of it and translated into a financial equivalent. Then there's also, of course, the concept of, even though there's the core mitzvot or the core commandments, there's also sometimes additional commandments that we've added that are very, very far away from the big ones, the core ones. And it's called making a fence around the Torah. So there's this idea that we want to prohibit people from doing things that are similar to the really, really bad things we don't want them to do, because we don't want them to go down this slippery slope of committing the bad thing. So we know that murder is one of those big ones. You should not commit acts of murder. So one of the commandments that have come to exist is prohibiting fantasizing about illegal acts, lest you be tempted to do them. And one could definitely say that there are many illegal acts in video games that you've played. If any of you have seen or heard of games like Grand Theft Auto, I believe the whole point of the game is to aggressively and violently steal cars and commits acts of murder. And there's lots of other games that do a similar thing. So you could also take that and take it that video games, because they involve some sort of fantasy, could be thought about through the lens of fantasizing about an illegal act. And of course, then there's tons of other principles that help us guide our behavior and our values. So one of them that when thinking about video games is idol worship. So how are we spending our time, money, and intention? You can think of idols as like the golden calf in a religious context, but you could also think about it as, are we spending too much time, money, and intention on one specific thing? Are we making golden calves out of a hobby that we have? So lots of folks are thinking about how much time, money, and attention are you spending on video games, right? If it's too much, if it's leaning towards maybe being excessive, that's not so great. But then another one, which is, I think, particularly prevalent, I think, in the present moment of Zoom and digital media, is not separating yourself from the community. Rabbi Dan, when he tells the story, has this lovely, amazing tale of one day during class, his daughter came up. His daughter, I believe, is in like 2nd or 3rd grade. And was like, hey, Dad, can I play Minecraft with my friends? And this was like in the middle of the school day. And his immediate gut reaction was, of course, to say, no, she's in the middle of the school day. She shouldn't be playing Minecraft with her friends. But then after a while, he said he came back and he asked her about playing, why she wanted to play Minecraft. And she said, Dad, like, in between our lessons, all of my friends from class get on Minecraft and play together, and that's how they're hanging out, because they were working from a distance. So of course, even though he really wanted her to be focusing on her schoolwork, the fact that all of her friends in these breaks were spending time with each other, and that was her social connection at that time, and then he wanted to make space for her to be able to do that. So you could also think that, like, even if there's a game that maybe you're not super fond of the content of it, if folks are getting together in a wholesome, mature, and healthy way and using it as a way to spend time, maybe that's also an okay thing to do. That being said, there's also the concept, right, of a light unto the nations, or Lagoyim, like we are supposed to hold ourselves to a high standard. So even if all of our friends are playing the most violent video game in the world, maybe that's not one we want to play either, because we want to express our values differently. And then, of course, there's the evil inclination, this idea that all of us in us have this inclination towards doing bad things, and that if we find safe ways to do them in ways that are protective and not actually harmful, that helps get out that evil inclination. So you could also think of like playing a bad guy in a video game as a way to live out some of that evil inclination in a safe way that doesn't actually hurt anyone. Another great story, of course, I use Rabbi Dan's kids all the time because I love them and they're filled with great stories, is his son, who is the sweetest, kindest, most considerate young man you've ever met, always plays as the bad guys whenever he's playing the Jedi game. Oh my gosh, I'm totally forgetting the name. Oh, who's the bad guys of the Jedi? Oh no, you can tell. I was always more of a Star Trek fan. Star Wars bad guys. Anyone who's watching from home after this is just like screaming at the thing. Sith, oh my goodness, the Jedi and the Sith. So there's a Star Wars video game, and his very sweet, kind son always plays as the Sith, who are the bad guys. And his, Rabbi Dan was like, why are you always playing as the bad guys? And his son was like, I just wanted to try it out. Like, he just wanted to try out what it meant to be like that. He still is the sweetest kid, even though he's played as the Sith for a long time in that video game. But it's just a way to kind of experiment with what it means to be something a little bit different than you are. Another great statistics is there's a video game where you can choose to either play, it's like Paragon or something else. Paragon is like the nice responses. And overwhelmingly, it turns out that when given an option to answer in a nice way or a mean way in a video game, like 80% of people, even in a fake video game, always choose to respond in like the nice way and not the mean way, which to me is such a nice example of, like, at its core, humans really don't want to be mean to people, even if it's digital, even if it's digital people. And then last but not least, there's always the plea for balance, not violence. So Maimonides, the golden mean, and Ecclesiastes, don't be overly righteous or overly evil. So at the end of the day, it's actually about balancing all of these different things: our desire to be in community with our desire to live our values, our desire to spend time on hobbies and things that interest us, that bring us joy, while also spending time on other things that are important in our lives. So finding a balance between all of these things. So unfortunately, in classic Jewish tradition, there's not a clear answer about whether or not it's okay to play a game that we consider violence or not, but there's lots of different ways to think about the social context in which they are happening. Luckily, there is some actually pretty strong evidence about whether or not video games can make you violent or not. The long story short, and I'm going to go over a lot of stats, but I will send a PDF that has all of these linked for people who are interested in diving deeper, is there's no evidence to support a clear or strong relationship between playing violent video games and committing violent crime. Sometimes I found this surprises people, and that's because I will say that media has done a very good job over the years of being very, very anxious about video games. Video games are relatively new as a format, and it's pretty common that whenever a new technology comes out, people are generally pretty nervous about it until we can figure out how to holistically incorporate it in our lives in a healthy way. And the thing about video games is they have grown so big and so fast, and they change so rapidly that it's been kind of hard for everyone to catch up. So even if you did play video games as a kid, they sometimes look and feel so different now than what many of us played when we were younger. It is a huge multi-million-dollar industry. It actually makes more money than Hollywood and has since 2014. And the stats say that something like 97% of teens have played a video game at least once in their life by the time that they are 16. So the question often is not whether or not your child will play a video game or will be exposed to a video game. It's really like, how are they going to approach that video game and how are they prepared to deal with conversations around that? So I'm going to run through a bunch of stats. I really like them. I won't nerd out too much, but I will give you some key takeaways for this just so you can walk away with some good reassurance that even if we play Call of Duty, we probably won't go out and commit any violent crime. So since Columbine, the number of studies examining violent video games has actually dramatically increased. So from 1997 to 2013, there was 140 studies about this, whereas there was only 10 between the years 1985 and 1986. And video games haven't been around that long. So that's an extreme increase from 10 to 140. Back in the day, most studies have reported a relationship between violence and video. Oh, sorry, let me rephrase this. Most studies that reported a relationship between violence and video games and real life violent behavior have since been determined to be pseudoscience or science with bad data, or even just actually very wrongfully and inaccurately represented. Some examples of this is a lot of the early studies were focused on really mundane outcomes, like whether or not gamers were more likely to troll or prank someone with loud noises or giving someone spicy food if they didn't like spicy food. While that is not necessarily nice behavior, it is very, very far away from being violent. Some other examples are they would ask people, like, if you feel frustrated after playing a video game. But the thing about games, just any technology in general, is it can generally be quite frustrating. If a game is difficult, it can feel frustrating. And sometimes that frustration is part of the enjoyment of someone being able to get past something that they weren't able to. And unfortunately, sometimes media just like misrepresented or badly reported data. For instance, and this is quite sad, the Sandy Hook shooter was in fact obsessed with video games, but the video game they were obsessed with was Dance Dance Revolution, which by most accounts is not considered a dangerous video game. It's really a dancing game. So the shocking thing about that obsession was actually that he played it alone for hours on end and was generally isolated from his peers. So in that sense, while they did report accurately that video games were being played, the thing that they were focusing on, which was that he was playing a video game, didn't really concentrate on what was going on, which that there was a social isolation aspect, which is often an indicator of other troubles going on that are affecting them. There's other like cool evidence, which is like if violent video games specifically were more likely to lead to violent crime, we would see that effect in other places. But the other country in the world that actually buys and plays more video games, which is Japan, actually has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. So even though in Japan, the rate of buying and playing video games is so incredibly high, their violent crime rate is low, very, very low. And my last like kind of colloquial fact is that violent crime has actually decreased substantially since the 1990s, while video game sales have increased substantially. So if it was a really, really strong relationship, we would see these trends kind of moving with each other, but instead we're kind of seeing them all over the place. That being said, there are some studies that show that video games do provide frustration, and that is more to do with difficulty than with content. Most violent video games like Call of Duty are actually specifically designed to be very difficult. So a lot of the signs of frustration that you see in people when they're playing are because of the difficulty level of the game. But you would see similar examples of that frustration, like throwing controllers, yelling, cussing, all of those sorts of things. If someone was playing a really, really difficult level of Tetris or some sort of arcade game that equally was very challenging, that was making them feel quite frustrated and angry. I'm sure many of us have felt that way when our computers have popped up with an error message that we aren't quite happy about. And luckily, other research shows that similar to games like rugby or football or other high contact kind of more violent games, video game players who are playing violent games and behave competitively in that space don't carry that behavior outside of the video game into the spaces that they're in. So just like you don't generally see football players like tackling random people on the street, you won't see people who are committing some sort of violent act in a video game taking that action into the real world. However, one big difference is that unlike physical sports, there's a lot of parents who maybe don't have experience playing video games themselves. So the ability to help teach good sportsmanship is really challenging if you've never played that game yourself. Football and basketball and other contact sports have kind of been the same for a very long time. So the methods of teaching them have changed, but this game itself has stayed the same, versus video games have changed really drastically. So it's sometimes hard to keep up. I play games a lot, like a lot. And I will say that even I sometimes have a really hard time keeping up with what the kids are into. And I know this because every summer they tell me things that I've never heard of before, and I have no idea where they found them. And I think of myself as very much so on the internet. We go way back. The good news is there are some positive benefits of video games. So the biggest one is that it does help cultivate social skills. The majority of gamers actually aren't antisocial. In fact, in 2014, North Carolina State University identified that loners in video game playing are pretty much the exception and not the rule. There's like an old stereotype of like gamers alone in a basement with no friends, and that's definitely not the case. Gaming is super social. Even if they're not playing a game together, people are watching YouTube videos or watching people play games on Twitch. There's a tendency towards making gaming a social event, which makes sense because it's a form of play and people really like to talk and think about play with each other. Also, many games hone strategic thinking, so you can think of it like chess, where a lot of video games require you to think of where you're putting your pieces in a strategic way to help obtain a goal or achieve a goal. Gaming is also a great way to get kids acclimated to technology and encourages digital literacy. And that, of course, is, when at an appropriate age and when at an age able to like use technology. Games are a really fun way to get kids interested in like how to use an iPad or a computer. I myself learned how to type playing video games. Actually, on the school computer, it was like one of those typing games where you had to like make a boat, race another boat. And the faster you typed, the faster your little boat went. So there's lots of ways that games can be used to help kind of acclimate people to technology, which is the #1 skill. Also, even if you don't want to become a programmer, I will say a lot of kids who play video games wind up getting interested in computer science, and some of them then go on to become programmers. So it's a great way to expose people to future career. It's also a form of play, so it can help increase empathy and decrease stress, depending on the game. Some games will stress you out more than others. I find shooter games very stressful. I am not very good at them, and whenever I'm playing on a team, my friends always lose and I feel really bad about it. It just stresses me out. However, I really like resource management games. So if you can think of like a Sim City kind of simulator where I'm trying to keep track of all of these little pieces of everything, that kind of game stresses my friends out to no end, and they constantly are curious of why I manage resources in a video game when I manage resources in real life as a camp director. But for whatever reason, I find it very stress reducing, and I enjoy playing it. So different games kind of speak differently to different people depending on how you're feeling. And kind of my favorite reason is video games really teach us how to fail, just like sports do. I think learning how to fail is a really important lesson, and learning how to fail in a safe space where there's not real life repercussions, and kind of working through that feeling and experience of failure. But you do need a guide, right? You do need people to help walk you through what it means to fail and to fail well. And games are super fun because the whole point of them is to kind of fail. Most games just teach you by failing. You didn't do a good job because you died in the game or you can't get past a puzzle. So it's a fun way to experiment in a safe way with the concept of failing. So really, at the end of the day, what a lot of research is saying is that how young people are playing a game can be as important, if not more important, than what they are playing. So the social context around how they're playing, who they're playing with, the conversations they're having, if people are helping them reflect on those experiences in a way that's tying them to other aspects of their identity and aspects of their lives, really have a strong impact on what gaming can mean. So it's really, I often say, it's not about shielding your kids, right? We know that they're going to encounter content about video games. It's really about giving them the tools to discuss and reflect on it in a productive way, and to create an environment where that reflection is encouraged and kind of something that's excited. One thing that I've noticed coming up is that media literacy, especially around video games, isn't something that schools are yet able to teach, mostly because there's a lot of other things schools have to be teaching, but also because schools, the technology that they use in schools, I don't know if you've ever attempted to like check the internet on a middle school computer, like in the building, but pretty much everything is blocked. So there's really no way for kids to be able to navigate that with a safe adult unless they're doing it at home or with a peer. So it's really important to make space between kind of finding ways to help them navigate that with people that they trust, with people that are excited to chat with them about it. You can think of it kind of in the same way that if you give a kid a pencil, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be a great writer, but if you give a kid a pencil and you give them supportive peers who are really excited about writing, and you provide them with a teacher or a trusted adult to help navigate and help push them, you can get someone who really enjoys and loves writing and can be a great writer. Some kids can do it with just a pencil, but a lot of other kids need a lot of other support around it to figure out, hi, hello, I'm recording, but there's a child and I want to talk, but I'll keep going, can really help in navigating that. So once again, I'll send this PDF out for folks who would like some suggestions or ideas or prompts to help them think through some conversation starters. So the first one that's really hard sometimes is maintaining a curious mind and asking questions. So the biggest thing I always suggest is asking what the interactions are like with other players, especially in multiplayer games. Every game has a different culture to it, just like I would say every like sports game has a different culture to it. Football players treat each other differently than soccer players do, than basketball players do, than rugby players do. There's different cultures for different games. And some of those cultures might not align with how you would like your child to be acting or behaving towards other people. Another fun question is like, what's the point of this game? So the point of the game might be like murder everyone on the field, right? Or it could be something like, oh, I want to get all of these pieces from this end to this end. Or sometimes people will say, like, even with Fortnite, like, oh, the point of the game is to get really, really good gear so you look really cool, or like get all the fun, sweet Fortnite dances. And then this one leans towards thinking about games for social emotional intelligence. So asking about how a game makes them feel. I realize this is easier to start when kids are a little bit younger. Once they get a little bit older, I know sometimes they don't always want to tell you about how they're feeling in any context, much less their video games. But asking about the social emotional aspects. When they're playing, do they feel supported or threatened or anxious? What's your favorite part of the game? This one is a fun joke, but like if you ask someone what's your favorite part of the game, they're like, my favorite part of the game is murdering everyone, versus like their favorite part of the game is being able to hang out and play with their friends, are two very different discussions, right? So finding out what is it that's attracting them to this game, and what values do you think that this game is expressing? I actually was super excited to hear that at your school, you've been doing a lot of values-based education in the religious school. And I actually think that's a beautiful place to start with hard discussions about content. There's lots of values that are expressed in video games, just like there are in books or in media or in any movies. And being able to ask, like, what do you think they're trying to say with this video game? Like, what kind of values are they talking about when they're talking about certain things in a way? Is just really incredible media literacy, and is also a great way to navigate what games feel appropriate to your family and what games don't. In terms of age appropriateness, people always ask kind of, how do you know what game is appropriate for what age? Most games are marked with kind of what age group is most appropriate. There's teen and mature. And I think there's everyone as well. So similar to kind of how movies are rated. Of course, you will know that different families are okay with different things, right? Like sometimes you're okay with a rated R movie because you've watched it before and you know what's in it. And sometimes you haven't seen it, so you don't want anyone to do it. So I would suggest kind of a similar thing is that it's great to use those as guidelines and then to fudge them and move them back and forth as you get more experience with the game, or if you feel that they're able to do it in a safe way, or if you're able to navigate that conversation. And one thing I've always wanted to do that would be a fun exercise to do as a family or potentially in religious school is I always thought it would be really fun to come up with an age, a rating system, but through the lens of Jewish values. So thinking about like, at what age would this game be appropriate if we're thinking about it through the lens of like these core values of our community. And it would be such, I don't know, I've been thinking about it for the past 6 months now, and it's now on my mind because I think that more than anything else, more than age, can really help people navigate hard conversations about values. And then the last one is, of course, revisiting questions in games as your kids age. So Rabbi Dan's daughter loves Roblox. Roblox has lots of different kinds of games on it. And so she played a game, she was experiencing nightmares for a lot. She was experiencing tons of nightmares, and they're trying to figure out why. And they realized through asking her that she was actually having nightmares about people chasing her in a dark place because she was playing a game in Roblox that involved people chasing her in a dark, confined space. So they figured that out, and then they talked with her, and they're like, okay, so we're not going to play this Roblox game anymore. But then about 6 months later, she wanted to revisit the game, and they said, okay, you remember you had nightmares? And she's like, no, I'm ready. And she replayed it and she was fine. And so that's also something that, like, depending on how a game is impacting your child, it's possible that that's going to change as you get a little bit older. So being open to the idea that you can revisit them, because as we grow and change, video games will affect us and change us in different ways too. And this one is more for YouTube and Twitch. So as I mentioned before, video games are incredibly social. And watching people play video games live is one of the up and coming pastimes, I would say, of our generation. So Twitch is a live streaming service owned by Amazon, where people play video games live in front of an audience that's hanging out with them on Twitch. Unlike videos on YouTube, it's hard, you can't pre-watch people because they're doing it live. So there's no way really to vet them ahead of time or to get a sense of what they're like. So there are some really nice streamers on Twitch, but one of the questions I would ask if someone comes up to you and says, like, can I watch this person on Twitch, or I really want to watch them, or even if they're already watching them and you just kind of want to get an idea of what this person is like, is asking about how the streamers talk. Like, do they talk nicely to each other, to the viewers? How do they talk about women or people of color? As I said, video game communities are microcosms of a larger world community. And so making sure that the folks that your kids are looking up to are people that you would like them to be looking up to and modeling is super important. What kind of language do they use? Is there a lot of cussing or bad words? Some bad words mean different things to different people. So making sure, like, if they're using bad words, is it the kind that you approve of? This one's fun. How do the streamers respond when something in the game doesn't go their way? I'm sure we've all seen it, but sometimes when a game doesn't go the way you want, that's sometimes when behavior of folks like makes us the most nervous or most stressed out, because when people are frustrated, they're not often at their best. So asking if the streamer has figured out a way to respond to failure in a way that you would like your child to model. How does the streamer treat other players, especially new players? Sometimes between friends in games, they call each other noobs, like newbie, and it's kind of meant as an insult. I'm not a big fan of that. I think it's quite exciting to be new and not good at something for the first time. Sorry, there's a bug in my face. So if I keep fingering my finger, it's because there's a mystery fly. And then why do you want to watch them? Like, are they watching them for the skill, the commentary, the community, the jokes? What is it about that streamer that's driving them? And then another nice social emotional question is, how does watching them make you feel? When you're done watching, are you anxious, upset, scared, mean? Do you have a hard time sleeping? Anything like that are great questions to ask. And then I do want to end with my favorite quote. I love Nintendo. I'm a Nintendo baby. I grew up in the 90s, so all of my video game consoles for most of my life have been Nintendo. I only recently started playing games on a computer because I was obsessed with Nintendo. And the thing I love about Nintendo is actually the creators are very aware that at the end of the day, video games are meant to be just one thing, which is fun and fun for everyone. So there's really no better gift that you can give to a child who, in our society right now, there's so much pressure in so many different directions. from school, from extracurriculars, from thinking about the economy, from like job hunting as they get older to like what university they're going in. There's so many things that are putting a lot of pressure. So finding moments of the day to carve out time just for play and for fun is such an incredible mitzvah, especially if they're getting to do that play and that fun with their friends. And the thing I love most about this quote is it says fun for everyone. So in the same way that we teach our kids to be welcoming people in on the playground and outside, in the real world, you can also help your child welcome people into the video game world and make sure that they are creating the type of internet that we would like to see in the world. I often joke at Sci-Tech that our mission is to make the type of internet where we're not afraid to read the comments. So I'm really big on the fact that I would like our children to create an internet where I feel very safe reading the comments on any news story that pops up. So as I mentioned, one of the things I'll be sending out, I have a PDF that links to all of these different resources. I definitely encourage you to do a deeper dive if you're interested. This first one, I would say the biggest book I can recommend is Moral Combat: Why the War on Violent Video Games is Wrong. If you're interested in the data and the history behind the research on violence in video games, they clearly, by the title, have like a very specific point they're trying to make, and they don't really touch on why there's lots of values-based reasons why you wouldn't want someone to play a violent video game, but great for data. But if you don't want to read the entire book, I used to have a podcast back in my pre-camp director days. And I actually did a whole series on violence in video games. And one of them is an interview I did with the authors. So if you want to shrink the entire book into 1 hour, you are welcome to just listen to the 1 hour interview of me before I was a camp director. And then the last but not least is if you are looking for some suggestions for some wholesome games or non-violent games, there's this organization called Homeless Games, which has curated a list of wholesome, which is predominantly non-violent games on Steam. So if you're looking for some cool indie games or games that aren't made by AAA developers that are pretty nice, to encourage someone to broaden what they consider fun if they're very fixated on the violent part of the video games, there's a lot of good suggestions there. But all of these are hyperlinked, and I'm excited to send them to you when you're done for you to peruse at your leisure. And that is the end of my presentation. That is the end of my tech talk.
Thank you so much. And I want to make sure that all of our families that are going to be watching on replay know that when we post our video, we will also link to that PDF right below on our website. So for those that are watching this playback, we will make sure to link that for them as well. And we can't thank you enough for being here this evening. I know we've got a couple of minutes where we can have a conversation. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording because that's where it'll get a little mundane if you're not here.
Before the recording is over, which I always tell people, I always joke that me and the internet were born in the same year, so we go really far back. So if you ever want to have a question about like internet culture or like a meme you don't understand or a joke that's not making any sense to you, I absolutely love it when parents email me and say like, I don't know what they're talking about. Can you help explain it to me? Whether it be like Discord or Twitter or a new social media app that's up. If you want someone to walk you through TikTok, for instance, like please don't hesitate to reach out, whether you're a Sci-Tech family or not. It's like my favorite thing to do. So please feel free to use me as a nerdy resource if you're interested.
Yes, and I also wanted to make sure that we let everyone know that there is a plethora of information available on the Sci-Tech website. So 6 points, scitech.org/east in particular for our campus here on the East Coast. And you can see all of the resources, and Sci-Tech has also done a phenomenal job of curating some really fun stuff to do at home while we've been in this pandemic time that we've been living in. So thank you for sharing all of those resources. And with that, I'm gonna let Kelly ask any questions she might have, and we're just excited to talk a little bit more.